Hello, Current Affairs listeners. This is Lily Sánchez. I'm the managing editor of Current Affairs, and I'm here to welcome you to a slightly different show today. I'm going to be interviewing editor-in-chief Nathan J. Robinson about his forthcoming book, Responding to the Right, Brief Replies to 25 Conservative Arguments. The book is coming out on February 14th. The book is actually the perfect gift if you find yourself in a situation where you're dating a reactionary or somebody that has such a political tendency. So this book will have all the answers that you need to finally put all your arguments to rest for good. So welcome to the show, Nathan. Hi.
Hi, it's nice to be with you here, Lily Sánchez.
So the first thing I want to ask you is not about the book specifically, but just a related point. So
All right.
When or how did you decide to become a person that was going to specialize in responding to the right?
Yeah. Gosh. Well, it's been part of current affairs kind of since the beginning. In fact, I think the very first article that I did for current affairs was a debunking of some talking points from David French of the National Review on guns. And it was like why every conservative gun control talking point is bad. So clearly I had decided at the moment that the magazine, like by that point, this tendency was pretty well established. There was no conscious moment where I said, I am going to be a specialist in reading conservatives and writing long responses to their talking points. But I think the reason that it happened is that I had been frustrated consistently with the fact that I saw all of these terrible right-wing books selling millions of copies, and I didn't see a place where you could go to just understand exactly why they're wrong. There was this kind of assumption among progressive and liberal and even leftist writers that like this stuff is self-evidently stupid, and so you don't need to engage with it.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to discuss a few of the 25 in depth, but that makes a lot of sense when you read some of the things that you quote in the book from various conservative commentators who say things like, Medicare for all is going to kill your grandma, or climate change isn't happening, or it is, but it's not a big deal, or things like that. And then you can easily be like, what?
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. So can you first talk about these kind of underlying themes in conservative arguments? There were three in particular that you talked about that are very useful, I think.
Yeah. I've tried to give people a sense of how to respond to particular conservative talking points in this book. So, as you said, one of them is like socialized medicine will kill your grandma. But then the intro section, which is actually quite long, is in two parts. Part 2 is replying to all these particular arguments. Part 1, which lasts about 50 pages or so, is just trying to understand conservative arguments generally. Because once you start to see these common tendencies, you see how every conservative argument is kind of a variation on the same thing. And this formula was identified in this great book, The Rhetoric of Reaction by Albert O. Hirschman, who talked about these characteristics of perversity, futility, and jeopardy. And he tried to make it 3 categories, but even the distinctions between the 3 are not that clear. Like, perversity is like, this social reform being proposed will have the opposite of the intended effect. Futility is this reform will do nothing. And jeopardy is like, this will destroy Western civilization. All of the progress we have made so far is now in jeopardy because of X piece, whether it's Social Security, whether it's the Voting Rights Act, whether it's like trans rights, whether it's gay marriage, whatever, whether it's the Green New Deal, whether it's Medicare for all. Every single time, what happens is there is some proposal for how to make society more equitable and fair. And the right-wing talking point is this will destroy everything. The foundations of society will crumble, and also it will cost, billions of dollars. It will raise your taxes, and nothing will happen. No good will come of it. So once you start to see that trait of conservative arguments, you understand what underlies so much of what the right says on any issue.
So I was reading that introduction of yours, and I read it a couple of times. And the more I was reading it, the more I found myself recognizing that all of this stuff is happening in the dominant COVID discourse. So like the dominant media discourses. And I made a list of it because there are so many.
Yeah, let's hear it.
I want to just point this out, right?
Yeah, because I don't talk about COVID, because I wrote this pre-COVID, but I'd love to hear how it applies. Yeah.
Okay, so the idea that the intended intervention will have the opposite effect, right? Okay, and there are actually doctors who have been saying and are saying that masks will actually make you sick and that masks will suppress your immune system. Those are examples from this one doctor, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, and she's been identified for, saying a lot of falsities, but that's an obvious one. There's futility. I think there's a lot of futility in these COVID arguments. Like masks won't work. They don't work perfectly, so why try? The virus is always going to be with us.
Vaccines, of course, don't work or will harm you.
They're not good enough. So yeah, well, why try? There's the hyperbole, the false analogies, such as masks are tyranny. Vaccine mandates are like Nazi medical experiments. That's like a Tucker Carlson point.
Mm-hmm.
There's this other doctor named Rashid Buttar who has claimed that COVID vaccines are genocide, which he's claimed on cable news. That's, just outlandish, right? There's a disregard for expertise. So if you happen to be like a pro-vaccine medical or public health person, you're accused of being like a shill for pharma. They're scare words, again, medical mask.
Yeah, well, these are like more minor tendencies that I also talk about, because I talk about expertise in the intro and scare language. So yes, there are other things. It's not just perversity, futility, and jeopardy. That's like the big overarching framework. And then there are other things like these experts are all a cabal of who are out to destroy you and everything you love. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to them.
And does that seem to border on like conspiracy theory to you in a way?
Yeah, I don't think it borders. I think it is it.
Okay.
It's like the right is full of conspiracy theories about how like all of the climate scientists are getting together to fudge the numbers in order to get grants, and paranoid and conspiratorial thinking runs very strongly through right-wing thought.
Yeah, and so you mentioned, maybe I jumped ahead a little bit too much, but right, you mentioned that there are these three kind of overarching ways to look at the arguments, but then you have a list of about a dozen others that are kind of other features of these arguments, which you mentioned. I don't know do you want to like point out a few more of those? I think we mentioned some, like the bad analogies, dismissal of expertise, scare words, hyperbole, assumptions about human nature. I do want to come back to that one because I have to talk about guns a little bit later.
So as I say, a really good way to understand a lot of conservative arguments is to go, okay, well, are they saying this intervention meant to help people or make society more equal is going to destroy everything? It's a horrible authoritarian disaster. And usually you'll find, they are saying that. And they might not be, it's important to note, they might not be wrong, because just because the argument is the same every time doesn't mean it's never correct. But it's very suspicious that the argument is the same every time. So first you see that, but then, as I say, there are these other things that are kind of related. So in keeping with the futility idea that any reform will not accomplish anything, is these assumptions about human nature, like human beings are naturally violent or lazy or prone to criminality, and you can't fix that. You can't fix inequalities because they emerge out of who we are biologically. Sometimes you get this in a real extreme genetic determinist view of someone like Charles Murray, who's basically like racial inequality. We can't address it because it's probably, due to, he just has a view that white people are genetically superior. You get that at the really extreme end, but then you get a lot of people saying, oh, no, I'm not that. Of course, I don't think there are these genetic, but I do think that there's this quality of human nature that makes, again, progressive reform totally impossible. And inevitably, we will try to lift people out of poverty. We will try to end homelessness, but you can't fix people who are, by their nature, prone to whatever it is that is the thing that's actually causing their misery.
Right. And so I feel like I'm skipping ahead again a little bit, but since we're on this thing about human nature and people, I feel like it is a good segue into the topic of guns, which, you mentioned at the end of the book, you refer to some of the current affairs coverage of guns, because guns is not one of the 25 arguments. But you point out this podcast that you did with a public health expert, David Hemingway, who has written and done a lot of research about things that could help reduce harm from guns, right? And one of the conclusions that he says public health has come to about guns is that basically you want to work upstream of the human being. You want to look at all these other factors, right? Like the features of the guns, all these other issues. You want to look at the product, right? Mm-hmm. But that's directly counter to what the right-wing talking points about guns tend to be, right? Which is that like guns don't kill people, people kill people. Or I looked at a sampling of some right-wing people's views on guns, like Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro, and Matt Walsh. And Candace Owens says that people aren't going to follow the laws. So even if you change certain laws, people won't follow them because they're criminals.
Futility argument. There you go.
But also like human nature, like these specific people are criminals and you can't do anything to stop them.
Yeah.
Matt Walsh says that it's fatherless families that are involved in almost all mass shooters or something like that. Although I've never seen that in people who've studied like the profiles of these mass shooters. I've never seen that actually stated. But he's convinced it's breakdown of family culture, which I feel like is, again, a human nature thing. Like, well, people who come from intact families are just good people, and these people aren't. And then Ben Shapiro says, well, this is another one, a statistics thing. He says that actually, if you look at per capita stuff, the U.S. has more shootings. He implies basically because we have more people. But he never cites any statistics for that or any research.
Because we have more people. Yeah, that's why China's shootings are so much higher than, Mm-hmm. No, it's nonsense. It's because we have more guns. And all the research shows it's because we have more guns. They really bend themselves out of shape to try and make arguments that blame anything but the guns, even though the correlation between the number of guns and the number of gun deaths is extremely strong. And as Hemingway points out, we have all this research that actually shows ways that you can reduce gun deaths. Like, for example, you can reduce gun suicides by making sure that when someone is depressed, they're not near a gun. You can, if you keep your gun locked and unloaded, it's less likely to be brought by a child to school or used by a child to shoot another child in your driveway. These are things that we know. And so we do know ways to fix or to at least, Hemingway talks about this like, says we should think about cars. We should think about all the auto safety stuff where it wasn't futile to try and fix cars. There were designs of the cars that were causing more deaths than different designs would cause. And with guns, he points out different ways in which guns are designed that make it more likely that they'll go off by accident or that people will assume they're unloaded when they're actually loaded. These are things that can be fixed. But of course, the right has futility arguments, which is they ignore all the research and it's, well, nothing can ever change. We can't do anything about it. It will always happen. And I think the futility arguments are very tempting because it does feel hopeless to confront situations like, a country that's just totally awash in guns and gun deaths. So these arguments resonate because you might think it would be futile if you weren't familiar with some of the research that Hemingway presents. And I think this family structure thing, which is also used by them to explain why racial disparities are not a public policy problem, because, it's all the black family. They've been saying this for half a century. It's another futility thing because it's locating a source of some problem outside of the realm where public policy can do anything about it. As soon as you pin something on fathers and families, it's like, well, we can't fix that, obviously. We can't change people's family structures forcibly through state policy. So we found our excuse for not doing anything about it. It's essentially futile. Or if it is to be changed, it is to be changed not through a collective action towards a policy end.
Right. And there are two things about guns that I kind of want to ask you about,
Hmm.
like what your opinion on. Okay, one is the fact that I think you pointed this out in the podcast, and I don't think it really y'all got too much into it, but the fact of the matter is we can talk about products like vehicles, microwaves, a crib for a baby or something. How do we design these things safer? These things are not fundamentally designed to harm people. They're fundamentally designed to make our lives better and easier and to help us accomplish things. But a gun, as you pointed out, is basically designed to inflict harm upon its target.
Yes.
So how does that work? How does it work to treat it as just another product? Like, it's just another product.
I know. I mean, I think that is a weakness of Professor Hemingway's whole thing, which is was taking what was done with these other products and saying, well, let's apply this same kind of analysis. And I do think, well, that's weird. It's like hand grenades. You're going to design a safe. But he is right that even you could say, well, okay, weapons inherently, obviously, are always going to cause harm because they are a device that is built for the purpose of causing harm. Even with that as a given, though, he points out that there are ways in which they can cause more harm or less harm. You can design a gun, as he says, that can't be fired by a child, that is a child-safe gun. Like, I know it sounds contradictory because it's a weapon, but it's true. You can design guns in ways that are less likely for children to be able to fire them. And if we accept some part of the futility argument, which is, okay, and I think everyone accepts some part of the futility argument on guns, which is, it's going to be at least really difficult to rid America of its guns in the short term, can we not at least agree that these things can be done to maybe take down, he points out you could intervene at 9 different points, each one of those bringing a 1%, 2% reductions in deaths. And then you have thousands of people who are alive who wouldn't otherwise be, even though you haven't solved the problem.
Yeah. And the other thing that he brought up was this idea of, having a better story to tell, essentially, and that those who want gun reform, I guess of whatever kind, to reduce harm should really lean into this liberty angle. This idea that because we have so much gun violence, it keeps us from being free to go out into the public. And it kind of essentially stifles our community. It increases fear. And that is a direct threat to your liberty. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought he was really spot on with that, because metal detectors in schools, do we want to live in a police state? I wrote about how my school, when I went back to visit it, has this giant, horrible security fence around. You used to be able to walk on and off campus. Now it looks like a prison. And prisons aren't free places. There has been a literal restriction of liberty at the school that I went to, where it is no longer possible to just walk freely on and off campus. That restriction on liberty is a response to the threat of gun violence. So I think he's dead on, because one of the reasons that right-wing arguments are compelling is that they do seize the language of freedom and individual empowerment to support things that do not actually further the ends of freedom and individual empowerment. Because when you live terrified to leave your house, when you live nervous about going to a public place where a lot of people are gathered, when you can't move around without security, you're not free. Mm-hmm. And I think freedom is important, and I don't think we should cede these things to the right, because I don't think they really do believe in them. I think they're very dishonest. I don't think they are building a world that is more free and open.
Mm-hmm. From listening to the public health perspective on guns, it sounds like there are many things that we can do to reduce the harm. And anybody who wants to reduce the harm should get behind these things. Like you said, short of a drastic reduction in the number of these guns.
Yeah, that is a good issue to do as a case study of how the futility rhetoric is just not matched by the facts. We just had the latest podcast with Alex Lawson of Social Security Works. And, one of the things that we talked about is how the right is constantly trying to spread talking points about how government can't get anything done, it can't help people, and all of its interventions will fail and be a big bureaucratic disaster. And he said one reason they hate Social Security is because Social Security works. It disproves it. It disproves the futility, jeopardy, perversity arguments because it's very efficient. The administrative costs are very low. It sends people their check. They like getting their check. They see the government working for them. It is proof every single day that the right-wing talking points are based on fear rather than empirical fact and research.
Right. And so this seems like a good point to transition to one of the 25, arguments that you counter in the book, which is that, I'm forgetting the exact phrasing at the moment, but basically that the government is the problem and the government can't do anything right. Because that seems like a huge one that we on the left have to deal with because, unfortunately, the policies that we want on the left are going to require some degree of government to carry them out, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to bring up that one, because that seems like a huge one in terms of just getting any legislation done, is countering this idea that the government just can't do anything.
No, I know. And the problem is the way that Republicans run government makes it so that your experiences with government are, and often the way that Democrats, neoliberals run government too, makes it so that your experiences with the government can be so negative that you subscribe to these talking points. So, when you go to the DMV and you don't have a good experience. In fact, I had an experience where they have a privatized DMV as well as the government DMV. They have a company that does like its own DMV. And it's kind of weird because you're walking into this company and it looks like the DMV, but it's a company. And they have this, they're called like Speedy.
Oh my God.
Speedy licenses. And they promise to like serve you in 5 minutes. And they're incredibly efficient and great and have really top Google reviews. And I'm not going back to the normal DMV when I can go to the company because it is, in fact, really good. And so when you see those contrasts, you could think, oh, well, government is the problem. But it's not true, right? Government is only the problem if it's poorly run. And so one of the things that is done is to try and identify the bad state of American public infrastructure and public goods with the fact that they are public. And so there's all these arguments on the right, well, public schools are failing, that's why we need to privatize the schools, that's why we need charter schools. Of course, this argument can be refuted almost instantaneously by encouraging people to look beyond the borders of the United States of America and to realize that it is perfectly possible to have high-quality public schools as there are in many places around the world. And if that is the case, then it cannot possibly be true that the difference between public and private is what makes American public schools bad. It's just easy to disprove. And I point out all sorts of things. I went to a public school, it was fantastic. So if I went to a public school, it was fantastic, clearly you can run a public school that's fantastic. And the question is, what is making the difference between the public schools that are fantastic and the public schools that are not fantastic? And it's not just money. Money's a big part of it, but it's also, do you have people who are really committed to making something that is good and that cares about, making school institutions that care about their students rather than being warehouses and prisons. So it is a very tempting talking point because they have all sorts of things to point to show how terrible government is. Like you and I talk about a lot, Obamacare. And I have written about the Affordable Care Act exchanges. It doesn't give you a very positive view of government when you have to buy health insurance on the Obamacare exchange. You go to healthcare.gov. But it doesn't say anything about the possibilities for good public services.
Right. Let me pause this here and just ask you a quick question about this DMV thing. So wait a minute. Who gets to go to the Speedy private corporate DMV? Anybody?
Anyone.
But why would they do that? I don't understand. But wait, so then what's going to happen to the public one? No one's going to use it, and then they're just going to be like, oh, we got to close.
But some people use it, although when I went, there weren't many tellers. There were a lot of empty, which made me think that there have been budget cuts at the public DMV.
So this is the problem. Yeah, show the thing doesn't work, and then you get to replace the thing fully with some private entity.
Yeah.
Right. But then here's the other thing. So if we were to apply the logic about government can't do anything, it almost becomes, like you point out later in the book, a philosophical thing that is not entirely rational. Because before I was, anywhere identifying as a leftist, I never understood that argument about government, because I was like, why government? Government's just a group of people, but there are groups of people everywhere. They can do good things, they can do bad things. Like, what is it fundamentally about government?
Yeah.
There's a revolving door, right, between like the corporate world and government. And so people who used to work in government might work for like McKinsey tomorrow, and they might do great things for McKinsey. And if government somehow corrupted people so much, why would there be this revolving door? And why wouldn't conservatives turn the same argument on corporations when they do bad things? Like, corporations must be inherently bad because look what they did with the opioids, or with toxic chemicals in the cookware, or whatever, right? Like, why do these arguments not get turned around on corporations?
Well, I can tell you exactly why they don't get turned around on corporations, which is part of the core theology of the right, is that the profit motive brings us all good things.
But even when it doesn't, even when there's these explosive revelations of a company like Purdue, which was deliberately, lying to people and doctors about the addictiveness of their drugs and making a killing off of it, how does that not ever turn people against corporations in the way that they are against government?
Well, it turns some people against corporations, but for the right, it's an inconvenient case that doesn't fit into the theology, and so it is just not discussed.
Okay. Right.
Because, in fact, the Purdue was following Milton Friedman's dictum, which is that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. That is a quote from him. He believes it absolutely, without qualifiers. He says that you've got to follow the law, but you really only have to follow the law because breaking the law might impact your endless quest for greater profits. But the belief that he put forth, and that is widely held on the right, is that it is almost impossible to criticize a corporation for doing wrong if they fulfilled their obligation to their shareholders, unless they went woke, in which case you can criticize a corporation. But one of the criticisms of the woke corporations is that they are not fulfilling the Friedman obligation, that they are putting being anti-racism over their duty to shareholders. And there's this phrase they use, go woke, go broke, where they say these corporations are hurting themselves through having values, because you're not allowed as a corporation to have any values.
I mean, when you put it like that, it also sounds to me like there's a little bit of like a shifting target going on. Like, well, okay, maybe the government did something right, and maybe corporations did something wrong, but then we've got this other thing that we've got to hold on to, this other like dictum or something. And it's because they didn't do that thing that they went wrong. Therefore, we still can't judge it, but, it was just an error. It was just an anomaly or something. That's really kind of, I don't know, that's kind of messed up, because when you shift the justification around, then it seems hard to ever get out of that argument.
Yeah, well, it is. One reason right-wing beliefs are compelling to people is that they have an answer for everything. So the point at which a corporation undeniably did something horrible, oftentimes the libertarian or reactionary defense or the excuse is this phrase that they have, and this phrase should send up your head to anytime you hear this. Remember that you are not in the presence of a genuine critic of capitalism, which is this phrase, crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is capitalism where actually the problem is government. So that is corporations that are subsidized by or bailed out by government. And if you can trace it back, they often say, well, we don't, of course, this is what like Ron Paul says, of course we don't like crony capitalism. And that's the bad capitalism. but it's all the fault of government for meddling and diluting the pristine free market, which, left to its own devices, would deliver us unto utopia.
Okay, that's a very interesting point, because I think that can transition us to the Medicare for all point. Okay, and I have seen the argument made by some economists that the problem with US healthcare is not all the problems that, you and I would identify, right? The fact that care is unaffordable and that the outcomes are terrible and et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is actually that it's not free market enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be the way to fix it. Don't universalize it. Don't socialize it. Make it more free market.
Yeah. It's the same theology, which is that the market, if left on its own, will solve all of our problems magically. They quote this phrase from Adam Smith about how selfishness becomes a virtue. And Ayn Rand wrote this book, The Virtue of Selfishness, this idea that, well, if we just have everyone pursuing profit, I will sell you something not because I care about you, but because I'm trying to make money, but it will be good for you because you want it from me. And then competition with someone else will drive down the price. And through the operation of the market mechanism, everything will be good. Again, the question is this a story about what could happen in hypothetical, beautiful, free market cloudland that exists in our minds? Or is this what we actually see? And one of the things that I draw people's attention to in the book is the degree to which right-wing arguments are speculative fiction. They are stories that are often very tempting because they tell you about a world in which they say, well, right now there's all this regulation, but if we got rid of the regulation, then things would be good. It's like, okay, well, how do we know whether that's true or whether you're just telling me a story about how things operate in a world that you've conceived of in your head? Well, one way we know we can tell whether something is true is to look at research on different systems that exist in the world and to see how they work and to see what they do and to see what the results are. And in fact, what we find is that the best performing healthcare systems all around the world are systems that are universal, that have heavy levels of government involvement in the marketplace, and that are universal, right? They give everyone care for as cheaply as possible, and they make sure that even when there is market competition, the state is carefully managing the market in order to achieve the result that the market would not achieve on its own, which is to ensure that even people who have no money, and of course people who have no money get nothing in a free market, that even people who have no money can get access to really good things, which is by definition impossible in a market economy.
Right. And then if you look at people who live in these systems, they like universal care.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's an important thing, right? Like, people don't want access to healthcare. They want healthcare. Like, we shouldn't want an insurance plan. We should want healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I feel like, though, when you say that to them, when you say, okay, well, what about these other countries where they do it? Then again, that's when like the sort of target shifts or the argument shifts. It's like, well, and you get to this in the book. Well, just because that works in the Nordic countries, it won't work here. We're too diverse. We're too different. We have too many special situations here and it won't work.
Yeah. This is an important one because if you succeed in proving that another country does something really well, then a difference will be found between the United States and that country that preserves the futility argument, which is, okay. And Dinesh D'Souza, I cite in the book because he makes the most absurd version of this that I've ever seen, which is, he said, Swedish socialism can't work because it was designed for people named Sven. Okay, well, I don't think that is the relevant factor making it succeed. Now, he says, what I mean by that is that there's homogeneity, they always say, because it's a big word and it sounds intellectual. They say there's a homogeneity in these countries, and the cultural homogeneity is very important. But you're like, okay, but is it? Like, what is the actual obstacle that the difference in demographic characteristics between Scandinavian country X and the United States is that would mean that a particular kind of financing system for the provision of health services works in one place but not the other.
Right. Honestly, it's just bullshit, right? Or it's something that if in theory you could prove, it would be so difficult that you would just be spinning your wheels forever and we're going to die waiting to find out. So we could put that difference into practice, right? Like it's absurd.
Yeah. But one of the things that I think people can do to make these cases feel less persuasive, because I point out that one reason they have power is because we don't actually know what's going to happen if you introduce any given new reform. So it is very easy to say, well, it could jeopardize all of our existing progress, and you don't want to risk that, do you? And you go, ooh, I'm not sure that I do. I like these things. And they go, oh, well, if you try this, all of the things that you love, this is the minimum wage argument, right? If you raise the minimum wage, actually, everyone will be unemployed because companies will have to cut back on their labor costs. And that will involve firing many, many people. And it could be you. So don't raise the minimum wage. And so, again, the question that you ask is, okay, well, does that happen? And then actually economists who used to believe that, the consensus among economists before the kind of empirical turn in economics over the course of the last 30 years was, oh, yes, raising minimum wages probably causes greater unemployment. Then they started actually looking, well, what happens? And the answer is, oh, no, it doesn't. It doesn't do that because you give people more money, they spend the money stimulates the economy. And employers can't really cut back because you need the same number of people, even if you have to pay them more. So you just find the money from elsewhere. So there are reasons why it doesn't actually happen in practice. So what you do when you hear these talking points about perversity, futility, jeopardy is you go back in history and you look at, were these exact same arguments made about, say, for example, the abolition of slavery? Oh, yes, they were. The exact same arguments. Oh, it'll destroy Western civilization. Oh, were they made about the Social Security? Were they made about Medicare itself, right? Not just Medicare for all, but were they made about the original Medicare? Oh, yes, they were. The conservatives were saying, this is a massive government intervention. It'll be a big boondoggle. It'll just cost money and won't do anything for anyone.
Exactly. And on the point of like employment, okay, can you talk just a little bit about your response to the talking point that like we don't need a Green New Deal?
Again, when you actually look at the arguments that are made on climate, it's the same stuff applied to a new issue, which is that, and I read the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, and they have gone from being climate deniers, which they used to just cast doubt on the science. And then when that became very difficult, they became futility theorists, where they said, okay, well, actually, the Green New Deal will just cost a bunch of money. It's not going to do anything. They're not going to help because China is the source of most of the emissions right now. So no matter what the United States does, the climate problem is going to get worse. It would only make emphasize that, it would only make this tiny bit of difference. There's a lot of, well, fossil fuels are here to stay. Look how many of them we use. If you tried to wean us off of fossil fuels, we would end up going bankrupt. They often say, oh, Europe's going bankrupt because they went green. That's a big talking point now. And it just can't change. And any attempt you make to solve the climate crisis will ultimately just cost money and plunge people into terrible suffering. They will all suffer as a result because you will be setting money on fire, essentially. So again, you should be suspicious when you read this stuff because it's the same damn thing on the latest issue.
And then you bring up the point that, the thing that specifically some people don't like about the Green New Deal, which of course was a resolution, which did not come to pass, but was that it connected the climate crisis to, essentially employment justice, right? So the idea is that, if your job is made obsolete by our transition to renewables, we are going to have another job for you on the other side. And that people don't like the idea of why are you connecting jobs with climate, like you have some other agenda or whatever.
Yeah. There's this idea that because there are these economic priorities of creating a more fair and just economy, in the Green New Deal, it's a Trojan horse for socialism. I think Bill Gates said, oh, the employment guarantee, that it's a Marxist proposal for dealing with climate change. So, of course, Bill Gates prefers geoengineering, a much more reliable and sound and not at all speculative solution to the problem. But the point being that I do explain, why it's essential to have the economic components. Like, if you give funding for a impoverished school that can't afford school supplies to put solar panels on the roof, people might resent that the money is not going to educate the kids. If you throw people out of work and don't give them new jobs, then yes, there is going to be a tension between the labor movement and the environmental movement. We saw in the Gilets jaunes protests in France, when I think there was a gas tax that made people very angry. People wanted the climate policy, but they didn't want it to fall. They didn't want the people who had the least money to have to pay for it, which is quite fair, because the people who make the least money are the people who have contributed the least to the problem, because as we know, it's the 1% that are the greatest source of emissions, and of course the global 1% as well. And so you've got to address justice and fairness, right? Otherwise, people aren't going to get on board with climate policy, because they'll feel quite rightly as if it's deeply, deeply unfair to them.
Right. That argument about fairness, even in jobs, it also shows up in other ways like that. But the idea that we can't go to Medicare for all, because then what about all the jobs in the insurance industry, medical collections, prior authorizations, all these people who work for the insurance bureaucracy, they're going to be out of jobs.
Obama said that.
Yes, that's right. And so it's like, okay, correct. But the existence of those jobs does not justify an unjust system. And it's a similar point you made about this piece that you wrote, I think it was last year, or I can't remember actually if it was in 2021 or 2022, where you wrote that, there are towns where the prison is like the economic lifeblood of the community because that's where the jobs are. And you're like, actually, no, the jobs don't justify the prison. Like, people can do something else, right? Like health insurance collectors, they can do something else. Prison guards, they can do something else. If we wanted to get rid of these things, we could have them do something else, right?
Yeah.
We could have oil and gas workers do something else. That's not a good argument for why we should keep these systems in place, right?
No, bullshit jobs are a terrible argument. I mean, they're economically worthless, counterproductive jobs. You could have people actually contribute something that is valuable to the society rather than something that is toxic and hurts people.
Yeah, so I just want to point that out, that can show up in a lot of different ways, this idea about jobs and stuff like that. So just to make that point, which is that, the left is not arguing that we leave anybody behind in these policies, right? We're not going to say, let's do Medicare for all, and all you people who worked in medical billing are just out of luck.
Right.
That's not the idea, right? Like, obviously, these systems have to have job justice components built into them, like the Green New Deal.
Yes. Although I will point out that also that there is a severe double standard where this is considered an argument against policy that it will cost jobs. But of course, every day corporations lay off tens of thousands of people because they figure out some way to automate the functions of people who then would have bullshit jobs if they were kept. And this is just intrinsic to the economy. But all of a sudden, with this one thing where it's going to cost a few jobs, all of a sudden now, this thing that happens all over. I mean, it's the same as the argument that Medicare for all will lead you to lose your insurance. What about your existing insurance? It's like, well, what about all the people every day who lose their jobs and lose their insurance, right? You all complain about that. Why do you all of a sudden complain about this? So there are harms that are selectively cared about the moment they are one of the consequences of a proposed progressive social reform.
Right. So we've gone through some of the arguments, that you've brought up and how to respond to the right-wing arguments. You say at one point, once I've shown that the right's core beliefs cannot be maintained by a rational human being, then we can enter into discussion about the sociological and psychological reasons why people might hold such mistaken beliefs. So I want to ask what your thoughts are about what are some of the sociological and psychological reasons people hold on to these beliefs.
Yeah, I don't like to get into this too much because it requires speculating on people's states of mind. My position has always been that I try and focus on just showing that the ideas are wrong because I don't know how to prove things like, well, people hold this belief because they have this deep-seated fear of the other or something like that. And I will point out that a lot of right-wing arguments, again, once we see that they are not sustainable through facts, we notice that they are grounded very much in fear. They are grounded very much in defending existing social hierarchies or trying to restore past social hierarchies that have disappeared. They are not always made in defense of a particular person's privileges, right? So there are conservatives who don't have any money themselves who will nevertheless defend billionaires, right? They do exist. So you can't say that conservative arguments are just made by people who are trying to find intellectual rationalizations for their own power and privilege. Thomas Sowell is very scathing of these because he says, well, I'm black, I grew up poor in Harlem, and I'm still making the argument. So, what's your response to me? So you can't make that argument if it will leave you with no response to Thomas Sowell. However, I will note that these arguments tend to be made by people for whom they also happen to be convenient. So, for example, there is a book called I Love Capitalism, and it is by the co-founder of Home Depot, who has $1 billion. And my reaction to that is, well, of course you do. It gave you $1 billion. And he's writing all about how capitalism is this wonderful system because it allowed him to succeed. And you think, yes, that does make it wonderful for you. That is a justification for why capitalism ought to exist for you. Right? You've produced a fantastic manifesto for why the Home Depot guy should not oppose capitalism. But I think King James, the first King James of England, produced a manifesto for monarchy, where he was explaining how wonderfully good monarchy was for the country. Think, well, yeah, monarchy is good from the perspective of a king. So some of these arguments do tend to be made, right? In the Wall Street Journal, you have all of these people from Wall Street arguing why we shouldn't tax Wall Street. So motivations there, you can see pretty clearly. Elsewhere, there are people who make the arguments who don't stand to benefit from the positions. But yeah, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of there is so much. I would say that when people make the arguments and don't stand personally to benefit from the position that they're taking, part it's because there is some persuasive power to the actual arguments, and people are quite reasonable to hear, oh, well, if we replaced our existing healthcare system with a totally different one, what if everything went horribly? You're not wrong to be cautious.
Right. So if one of the purposes of your book is to help arm people who want to think about conservative ideas, but help arm them with responses, they want to think things through, they want to really give them their due hearing, so maybe they can have conversations with other people about these things. Then I think another way to use the material you've written about is something that you already did, this piece that you wrote about the moral panics, where you do get into Hirschman, a lot of these things we've talked about that underlie the conservative arguments, but you've used that analysis to look at like the people in power, right? And what those people in power are trying to do with those arguments in order to kind of manipulate the public to accept the things that they want as the people in power, right?
Yeah, because there are lots of examples where these conservative arguments are, in fact, used to justify the status quo and to try to stop people from challenging existing conditions. The minimum wage argument is empirically unsupported. However, every restaurant CEO is going to make it over and over and over, which is, I'm going to fire everyone if they raise the minimum wage. And you go, well, every time we raise the minimum wage, actually, the CEOs just pay it because you can't fire half your workforce and get the same amount of labor. So you're probably not going to do that, even though it's what you're threatening to do. So there are all these arguments that are made by people who have interests in making sure that you don't believe the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
The Wall Street Journal op-ed page is full of people who don't want their investments in oil companies to be worthless. And, if we did fundamentally redistribute wealth, it would be their wealth. And so, of course, they want to show that redistributing wealth would destroy civilization, be a total catastrophe, it wouldn't accomplish anything, blah, 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 human nature, blah. They'll throw all of this at you to keep you from trying to do anything to rectify the injustices you see by saying that the injustices are natural, that they are inevitable, or even that they are good.
Right. So that article that I was mentioning, that was from November of 2021. If people want to look that up, it's called How Conservatives Manufacture Ghost Stories to Protect the Powerful. In each generation, conservatives manufacture a new threat to civilization, from communism to Iraq's weapon of mass destruction to critical race theory. And the right depends on the fear of a scary other for its political success because its actual policies are so unpopular.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it.
Wow. Yeah.
They've got to convince you that we can't raise the minimum wage without disaster, because if that wasn't true, then we should raise it. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
we should do it. But there's overwhelming public support for a $15 minimum wage, for a government healthcare program. No one wants the world to be burned in the climate catastrophe, right? People want their grandchildren to inherit a livable world. So the only way that those who would lose out if this progress was made, the only way that they can get us not to do it is to try to convince us that by trying to address the problems, we will in fact make the world worse. But I hope what I can do with this book is to equip people with, an understanding of what is being done, so that they know propaganda when they see it, and so that they see what is common to every video on PragerU, to all of Ben Shapiro's lectures, to all of the stuff Jordan Peterson says about lobsters and social hierarchies and why lobsters show us we have to, that men have to rule, or whatever this theory is. Because once you see it, you won't be susceptible to it.
Right. And I would encourage everybody to read the book. It's a really good read. It's a really enjoyable read. And once you get through the introduction, you really will just begin to see these kinds of techniques used just everywhere. Just take a look at the newspapers of the day and what the discussions are, and you will just see them everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had this shocking realization with COVID. I was like, this is COVID.
I hadn't even thought about that. I hadn't even thought to apply the framework that I lay out in the book to the pandemic. But yes, it's exactly the same stuff. It's like, actually getting the vaccine will hurt you, or actually these public health measures will create an authoritarian disaster and society will unravel, or, all the time. Same shit.
Right. And it's just
different
incredible.
Issue, same shit.
Yeah, it's the same shit. It's different societal problem, same shitty arguments. And yeah, it just gets people to go along with it. And it's horrible. I mean, like, the situation with COVID is horrible. Like, people are unnecessarily dying.
Yes.
Because we just don't want to do what it would take to actually address the pandemic.
Right. But the ultimate message of the book is quite a hopeful one, because the first book I did, Why You Should Be a Socialist, was kind of laying out the positive program. And this is kind of the negative, the critiquing, the debunking. But there is a positive embedded in the negative, or implied by the negative, which is, okay, well, if all of these arguments for why we can't accomplish anything good together are bullshit, then we can. The whole reason is we can do good things. We can fix our problems. You don't need to be hopeless. I mean, your article about the pandemic was that you wrote in December of 2021 was continuing the pandemic as a choice. It's a choice.
Yeah. And I think when you were editing that piece, you had this line that I remember, because I didn't write it, where you said, like, what is the goal here? Like, is the goal here for us to make sure that we allowed people to make their individual choice? And even if that meant like they were going to die, basically, I think you put it better than that. But you're like, yeah, like, are we just all a country about individual choices, even if it means you're going to die? Like, yeah, it's just incredible. Okay, so on that thought, I know you've laid this out, like the case for socialism in your book, but if conservative arguments have all of these things underlying them that don't want us to change things, their underlying values kind of we can see in those arguments, what would you say like are a list of the few values that encapsulate or the values that we have underlying left arguments for the things that we want to see happen?
Yeah. Well, I talk a lot about how socialism begins with the principle of solidarity. It begins with, in the place that Eugene Debs talked about, while there's a lower class, I'm in it, and while there's a soul in prison, I'm not free, which echoes of which you could hear in Bernie Sanders' great speech about fighting for someone you don't know. I think that the place that socialism begins is through believing that the sufferings, the conditions of people who are not yourself, who are very different than yourself, that they matter. It sounds very simple. Everyone will insist that they believe in this, but then they don't really, right? Certainly the right doesn't, because their whole ethic is to make excuses for the sufferings of other people and to explain why actually people get what they deserve. I think that socialism tends to believe that everyone universally, it tends to speak in universals about everyone. Everyone deserves X. Everyone deserves a good life. And I think if you start with everyone deserves a good life, no exceptions. Socialism tends not to have exceptions. And when you start there and work it through, that kind of simple principle of universal solidarity, that gets you most of the way to having a socialist program.
Right. And then I think there's one of these short articles you've written over the years, which says, we should focus on the outcomes that we want and how can we do everything we can to get those outcomes to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So if we want fewer gun deaths, what can we do to accomplish that? If we want everybody to have healthcare, what can we do to make that a reality?
It sounds obvious, right? But it's not obvious. One of these things that's obvious, but it needs to be said and needs to be actually thought about and taken seriously. It's like, okay, well, what are the plans that would solve the problem? What do we know about what will work and what won't? Never mind, this won't work. Okay, some things don't work. Some things do work.
Yeah, and I think the logic makes sense, though, even just on an individual, like if you're thinking about like your individual family or your sphere of like loved ones, you want the best for the people around you and you do things to try to make that happen. Like you want your children to grow, so you feed them, you cook for them, you take care of them. Like you want the best for people, so you just do things to make that happen. I think that we all do that in our individual lives, like every day. And so applying that up to like a societal level, I think we know how to do that. We just need to get like these crappy arguments, out of our heads.
Yeah, I've been referring to this book in my own thinking as what I call ground clearing. This is the attempt to kind of sweep away just the stupid, distracting, bad arguments so that we can then get to what I hope to do in future books, which is the actual really difficult and tough work of helping to construct something that is useful. I want to do a whole book on like analyzing experiments over the course of history in egalitarianism, utopian communities, democratic socialist policies, obviously the communist countries, and what goes wrong, what goes right, and what lessons can we take, and what do we know about how to do things that aren't a disaster. I'd love to do that eventually. But in order to get there, I want to first clear the ground by helping you to spot all the bad arguments and propaganda.
Well, that was going to be my last question, actually. What's your next book? So I think you answered that. But I would say everybody get the book because we have like serious ground clearing to do. And there are people in your lives you should talk to about these things. And people can be persuaded, right? Like people can be changed. People can be moved, right?
That's right. They have to be. We have to have faith that people can be moved. Otherwise, we're never going to win because If most people aren't with you, if most people aren't already leftists, then you have to have a very strong faith that you can change minds.
Right. So I think that this book plays a very important role in that.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone buys it. Valentine's Day. Get it for your Valentine. Get it for your whole family. Get it for every reactionary in your life. Send copies to every conservative you hate.
That's a direct order.
All right. Well, thank you, Lily, for this delightful interview.
Well, thanks for letting me interview you, and hope everybody has a good day.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.